Morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the launch of our Future Energy Scenarios, Pathways to Net Zero. It's great to see so many of you here, both online and in person, where we are delighted to welcome you to the IET Savoy Place, which is a building with a rich history where advancing and sharing knowledge about science, engineering and technology is at the heart of its purpose. I'm Claire Dictor, Director of Strategy and Policy at the ESO, where our future energy scenarios form a key part of our future thinking, underpinning network investment and market design, and driving both our strategy and I'm sure feeding into a lot of the decisions that you make as well. Today marks the launch of this year's Future Energy Scenarios Pathways to Net Zero report, which is now live on the ESO website, and I know some people have already downloaded and read it this morning, which is impressive. And also on there you can find all of our data and modelling assumptions. Before we start today's presentations, I'm just going to give you some housekeeping information. There is no fire alarm practice planned this morning, so if a fire alarm does go, please follow the green signs down to the exit. In terms of facilities, you should have passed those on the way up from the Maxwell Library. And if you need the Wi-Fi code, it's really long and complicated, so there are QR codes down in the Maxwell Library where we were before, which you can scan to get onto the Wi-Fi. As we move through this morning, after me you're going to hear from Lauren Stutchfield, who is our Head of Energy Insights and Analysis, and she's going to talk you through some of the key assumptions and changes in this year's publication and the priority actions that are needed to deliver a fair and secure decarbonised future. We will then be joined by an excellent panel of guests who will debate those actions that are needed towards decarbonisation and take questions from the floor. And we will be joined by Rita Wadey, who is Head of Energy Policy here at the ESO, Jane Toogood, Co-Chair of the UK Hydrogen Delivery Council, Josh Buckland, Partner at Flint Global, and Ginny McCauley, Director of External Communications at Smart DCC. The panel and the Q&A will be followed by lunch and networking, where I do hope that you will stay and talk to everyone who's here present, and particularly you will see that ESO employees have orange lanyards on, and we have plenty of them here to answer all of your detailed questions about analysis and assumptions and modelling. We have further events online on Wednesday and Thursday this week to do some deep dives into some of the topics. You can still sign up for those and just go to the FES website. So now, to turn to the outcomes from this year's report. Great Britain has made significant progress in reducing carbon emissions since 1990, but it is clear that what has got us here will not get us all the way. We must move further and faster to meet carbon budgets and net zero whilst delivering a fair and secure energy future. The evolving dynamics of the energy system call for action to be taken within the next 2 years to deliver the fundamental changes required to achieve a fair, affordable, sustainable and clean energy system by 2050. This means we must prioritise steps that will enable the delivery of cleaner, cheaper energy generation and greater flexibility, whilst ensuring a resilient system that delivers security of supply for consumers. Ongoing global conflict continues to create international uncertainty in energy markets, with the long-term consequences yet to be determined, and the cost of living and energy crisis continues to impact households and businesses across Great Britain. Our pathways highlight the opportunity to move away from the levels of energy imports we see today, enhancing our energy security and helping to protect from supply disruptions, geopolitical tensions and price fluctuations in international markets. As the electricity system operator, we are on track to be able to deliver and operate a net zero carbon electricity system for short periods by next year. And this sets us up to be able to operate a clean power system all the time in the 2030s. Later this year, we will transform to become the National Energy System Operator, NESO. We will put our customers, homeowners, businesses and local communities at the heart of our work. Building on the strong foundations of the ESO, we will deliver a future where everybody has access to clean, reliable, affordable energy. We will develop a whole energy system view of future network requirements, as well as future market direction, so we can recommend actions to optimise networks and markets across vectors and reduce costs for consumers. We will also provide independent advice to government and Ofgem on energy policy developments. In recognition of the expansive energy transformation that is required to Great Britain's network planning, this year's Future Energy Scenarios framework has evolved from scenarios to pathways to explore narrower ranges and strategic, credible choices to propel us on the route to decarbonisation. FES creates the foundation upon which our future network investment plans will be built. We look forward to working with industry, the government, Ofgem, and our stakeholders and customers as we transition to NESO and build upon our analysis and insights to deliver on our critical role for society and the economy. Decarbonisation of the energy system is the challenge of our generation, and the time is now for clear and decisive action. And on that note, I'm delighted to hand you over to Lauren Stutchfield, who's going to talk you through some of the key insights from this year's report.
Thank you very much, Claire. So, as Claire said, I'm Lauren Stutchfield. I'm the Head of Energy Insights and Analysis in Strategy and Policy, and many of you will have seen me stand up here for the last few years, and I've seen many of you in the audience. So thank you to those of you who are here in person and to those of you who are watching online. So, first of all, what a year, what a few months, so much has happened. It's not just energy that's moving quickly and undergoing an awful lot of change. I could stand here for the next half an hour and describe just how much has happened. So the key message, and I'll repeat it several times, decisive action is needed within the next 2 years to deliver the fundamental change required for a fair, affordable, sustainable, secure, net zero energy system by 2050. And for that, we need more change. And we need it now. So one of the things which is already happening is our network planning process. So this is undergoing a major transformation as we move to centralised strategic network planning in collaboration with government and with Ofgem. Strategic and timely investment across the whole of the energy system is critical to achieving our decarbonisation targets and minimising the constraints we see upon our system. This strategic evolution forms part of a wider industry overhaul of Great Britain's energy system. And FES underpins many of the decisions that we make as part of that transformation. So we've needed to respond to this change. And so we've needed to respond in how we do our FES and also what we show. So we've developed our modelling and included further economic analysis. We've moved from scenarios to pathways. You'll notice our longer title, Future Energy Scenarios, Pathways to Net Zero. So you're probably wondering, what is that difference? It just sounds like semantics over the wording. I know, but there is a difference. So the biggest difference is that scenarios used to show us the widest credible range that we thought we could see in the energy system. And now the pathways have narrowed. So we've reduced that range that you would have seen in the scenarios, and we're providing more direction and strategic routes to meet net zero to allow us to give more commentary on what needs to happen and when. The FES remains independent and is built on all of your stakeholder feedback. And yes, we've optimised it more, but we still have to start with what we have today and what's in train and what we know. This in mind, when we started our analysis, the election hadn't even been called. So that in mind, we can still see in our reviews, in our analysis, in our understanding, and in our publication that our key messages and the decisions that we've made are still clear. We need swift and decisive action over the next 2 years to keep us within the trajectory of our pathways. And this is in line with everything that we've heard so far from our new government. A nuance I feel I have to point out, though, is just because we've narrowed the range from scenarios to pathways, the level of uncertainty in our future hasn't changed. But what we need to be able to do is take actions, make decisions and recommendations on this narrow trajectory in order for action to be taken. And thus, when action is taken, we can feed it back into our FES pathways. Alongside the pathways, we still do present a counterfactual. So this will show you what could still happen if we don't meet our decarbonisation targets. We still assume that progress is made. We don't stand still where we are today, but everything is slightly delayed. So I'll come on to the pathways and the counterfactual in a little bit more detail in a few slides. But for now, I will take us on to our key messages. So for those of you avid readers, you'll understand the key format that we normally do. We have 4 areas with underpinning statements. We've changed that this year, and everything can fit under the main banner. I said I would repeat it. Decisive action is needed within the next 2 years to deliver the fundamental change required for a fair, affordable, sustainable and secure net zero energy system by 2050. Underneath that, we have 8 different action areas. I should also point out that the order, please don't infer from that it's an order of priority, merely a grouping of 8 things. So I'll take you through what each one of these mean in turn. Strategic network investment. We need to accelerate the delivery of whole energy system infrastructure through a strategic approach to network investment and the introduction of planning reforms. Hand in hand with this, we need whole energy market reform. We need to deliver market reform considering electricity, gas, hydrogen and carbon dioxide. We need to ensure that we have the energy markets that provide for and work with reliable and strategic planned energy system. We want to focus on hydrogen for hard-to-electrify applications. We need to prioritise hydrogen and get the correct business models in place and kickstart the delivery of hydrogen and carbon dioxide transportation and storage needed for system flexibility. As we've said for many years now, and many of you will agree because it's a conversation we debate hotly, we need to accelerate heat decarbonisation. And one thing that we are sure of is that we need to include a faster rollout of heat pumps, irrespective of a decision on hydrogen for heat. We need action now. Smart technologies. We need to deliver innovation and build customer trust. We need to build on affordable smart technology. We need to enable consumers to save on energy costs whilst helping with the management of Great Britain's electricity system. Energy efficiency. I say it every year, and I'm going to keep on saying it every year. If we use less, it's more efficient, and therefore we should invest in energy efficiency improvements across all sectors to reduce overall energy demand. Connections reform. Another big topic which many of us are discussing almost daily, if not daily. We need to expedite the delivery of clean, low-cost and reliable new technologies, especially long-duration energy storage. And we need to reform our connections process. Supply chain and skills, the final of my 8. Invest in a supply chain and skills to deliver the low-carbon technologies and infrastructure needed for net zero and enable the UK to become a world leader. So just one more time, just in case there's any doubt, decisive action is needed within the next 2 years to deliver the fundamental change required. You're probably also wondering why we've time-bound it. Why am I saying that all of this needs to happen in the next 2 years? Well, this is to focus our mind on the immediacy of these actions and decisions which are required. And this is in line with many of the things that we know are coming and are on the near-term horizon. So we have a decision on hydrogen for heat expected in 2026. We're expecting the first CSMP to be delivered and decisions about REMA. And most importantly, as we've seen through our analysis, CB6 is on the horizon, and in order to meet the carbon budget 6, we must take action now. So you'll all be used to our old framework that we've used for our pathways. Well, along with everything else, that's gone through an evolution as well. So this is our new pathwork framework. So we've got new pathways. They're not directly comparable to the scenarios that we had before. You can't compare one for one. And the framework works in a slightly different way. So from here, you can see the pivot between energy sectors, energy vectors between hydrogen, electrification and gas as you move around the dial. And you can also see the levels of consumer engagement, demand flexibility and demand reduction vary across the scenario pathways. Vary across the pathways. I knew I was going to slip at least once. Where's the swear jar? So the new pathways that we have are holistic transition, electric engagement and hydrogen evolution. And you will also see the counterfactual shown on the framework. So you're probably wondering, tell me a bit more detail about what that means behind that framework. What does that look like? So, brief summary, of course there is more in the document. Holistic transition sees net zero by 2050, and it includes a mix of electrification and hydrogen, and very high consumer engagement in the transition. Electric engagement shows net zero by 2050 as well, higher levels of electrification, and strong consumer engagement in the transition. Hydrogen evolution sees net zero by 2050, there's a theme here, fast progress for hydrogen in industry and heat, and lower levels, comparatively, of consumer engagement. And again, the counterfactual is there, where net zero is not achieved by 2050. We still see progress compared to today, but there is a more heavy reliance on gas across all sectors, especially in power and space heating. For more detailed information, so today I'm only giving you an overview as to what you can expect as the headlines. We have many more webinars across the rest of the week. So we have some on Wednesday and on Thursday, and there you'll be able to see more details behind the fundamentals which have driven this analysis and have the opportunity to ask as many questions as you would like on the data that sits behind it and the modelling that we have done. So one thing I did want to highlight was some of the changes that we've made in the decisions and the modelling in order to narrow that range from scenarios to pathways. It's very easy to talk about it, but you're probably wondering, well, what does that actually mean? So I've picked a few just to take you through, and they'll be discussed again in more detail throughout the week. So the first is home energy efficiency. So I've already mentioned that using less is more cost efficient. So in order to move from scenarios to pathways and to optimise the outcome for the end consumer, we've assumed high levels of energy efficiency across the different pathways. And then we have heating technology outcomes. So the majority, not everybody, the majority of stakeholder feedback indicated that the rate of hydrogen boiler and heat pump uptake in FES 23 was too fast. So we've reflected this, but in turn, we've still had to say that significant action is required in order to meet carbon budget 6. And so we've balanced those two things and changed the range in order for us to achieve our decarbonisation targets, but also reflect where we are today. BECCS is another area which is critical. So in order, again, for carbon budget 6, we need carbon reduction technology. And so we've included a change in profile of the BECS rollout throughout our pathways. And this is to compensate for a slower emission reduction outlook in other sectors, so beyond those that we would model in FES. Lastly, we've made some changes to our blue hydrogen. So reflecting stakeholder engagement and what we're seeing happen at the moment, we want to focus blue hydrogen towards industry to ensure that their needs are met for their supply of their fuels, but also to allow for a faster transition towards decarbonisation. As such, across all net zero pathways, we've increased the share of blue hydrogen production capacity relative to that of green hydrogen.
With or without carbon capture?
We'll come on to that in a second. That's all right. So we've included carbon capture as part of BECS and DACS across the scenarios. But I will grab you in a bit and tell you some more facts. But you bring me on to a very nice segue about where you can find out more. Thank you very much. I'll pay you later. So these are some of the documents that we have available. So as well as contacting us via our email address at the bottom or our website or at events like this where you can ask us as many questions as you would like, there are these documents. So we have the main document, which was published at 10 a.m. Congratulations to those of you who have already downloaded it, but I'm afraid you don't win a prize, other than the fact you got it downloaded. We also have changed the FES in 5 to Pathways at a Glance. We've been lying to you for the last few years. You couldn't read that in 5 minutes, so we've changed the title. So that's still effectively our executive summary. So there you'll be able to see the headlines and the all-important Sankey diagrams, which I know you all love. Thank you for whoever just said, oh yes. And one thing we know from stakeholder engagement is that the FES is a really useful tool for new starters to the industry. It gives you a great background as to what's going on and what the different technologies are. But I also know you don't want to read that every single year to try and go through and find out what we're saying that's changed this year. So we've got a separate energy background document that we keep up to date. Alongside that, the all-important data workbook. How many worksheets are in it, roughly?
A lot.
Too many to count. So every bit of data that we can share on our inputs and our outputs is in that data workbook. If in doubt, contact us. We'll help you find something. It should all be in there that we're allowed to share anyway. We do purchase in a few inputs, which we aren't allowed to put on there. And what's new for this year is we've changed how we comment about our assumptions. We know we need to give more transparency, more depth in what we've decided and why we've decided it. So we're improving how we share our assumptions, and there will be several different documents coming out over the coming future to help engage you on that conversation and challenge our assumptions and to provide clarity and assurance on what we've done. And alongside that, you've got the modelling methods document, which describes at a high level as to how we've done everything that we've done. So, quick reminder, quick plug, points mean prizes. Points are how many of you attend. So these are our different webinars that we have across the coming week. So you've got one which will cover FES changes and modelling assumptions on Wednesday, Pathways to Net Zero on Wednesday afternoon, and then Energy Consumer and Demand Side Flexibility on Thursday morning, and then Energy System and Supply Side Flexibility on Thursday afternoon. So I urge you all to consider the impact that you can make. It's no good me just standing here and telling you what we believe should happen or could happen. We need to work together as an industry to make change for the greater good and to achieve the energy transition that we need. So let's work together to achieve a brighter future. And many of us in this room, if not all of us, have some influence over this future. So let's work together to achieve it. And At this point, I'll say thank you very much for your continued support. We work with all of you to help engage and shape what these future energy pathways are every single year. And without your engagement and the conversations we have throughout the year, it wouldn't be possible. And so at this point, I shall hand back to Claire for the panel and Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much for that, Lauren. And we're going to move into the panel session. So I will introduce everyone and ask a suitably broad opening question so that you can make some opening remarks. Then I'm keen that we get to Q&A as quickly as possible. So for those of you who are in the room, get thinking of your questions. There are roaming mics, so if you have a question, please do wait until you have a mic in your hand to ask it. Otherwise, the people who are online will not be able to hear the question. And I will just reiterate what Lauren said. We have lots of the team here who all have on orange lanyards, so please do ask them the detailed questions about modelling as assumptions, because I'm sure the panel has not got through the full report and will not want to be answering. Yes, Jane has, apart from Jane. For detailed questions on analysis, assumptions or modelling, then please do ask the team. Okay, so as I said, I'm delighted that we've got such a fantastic panel joining us this morning. First, we have Rita Wadey, who is Head of Energy Policy at the ESO. Prior to joining the ESO, Rita was Strategy Director at Beyond 2050, a hydrogen-focused public affairs consultancy, and before that, Deputy Director, Hydrogen Economy in BEIS. Rita's had a 22-year career in the civil service in a range of policy and corporate roles, including Chief of Staff to the Permanent Sec and Head of Fuel Poverty Strategy, Distributed Energy, International Climate Change, Science and Equality and Human Rights. Next to Rita, we have Jimmy McCauley, who is Director of External Communications at Smart DCC. Jimmy leads the external communications function, and prior to this, he led on public affairs for National Gas. He has previously worked for UK Trade Body, leading their policy engagement and advocacy on consumer affairs and transport decarbonisation. And his experience also includes roles at the Bank of England and the Financial Ombudsman Service, as well as parliamentary research for a former minister and select committee chair. Jane Toogood is co-chair of the UK Hydrogen Delivery Council. Jane is an experienced, well-connected international CEO with a track record of impact and delivery, awarded an OBE for services to low-carbon hydrogen. Jane is a recognised thought leader and trusted advisor on international and national policy on hydrogen, clean tech, innovation and energy transition, as well as a growth leader in sustainable technologies, business, materials and the chemicals industry. And last but not least, Josh Buckland, partner at Flint Global, which is a policy and regulatory consultancy, and there he leads Flint's work supporting clients on energy, climate and sustainability issues. Prior to joining Flint, Josh was Energy Advisor to the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and previous to this held a number of other senior roles at the Centre of Government, including 3 years in the Prime Minister's Policy Unit in No. 10 Downing Street, leading on energy environment. He was also head of the Energy Policy Team in HMT, where he led the department's work on major infrastructure negotiations, including nuclear and offshore wind. So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm going to start off with a fairly high level and broad question, which you can choose to do with as you wish. So considering today's energy system and existing policies, what level of confidence do you have in our ability to achieve a fair, secure and affordable energy system by 2050? And in your perspective, what are the crucial actions that need to be taken and potential pitfalls that must be addressed within the next 2 years to achieve this goal. We'll maybe go in reverse. Let's start with you, Josh.
Thanks, Claire. And yeah, good to see everyone this morning. This might be a bit of a dangerous thing to do, but I'm going to try and start with a football analogy. Because someone had to mention it, right? So it might as well be me. Just to try and answer the question, kind of, let's pretend yesterday evening didn't happen. You kind of go backwards to just before the game and you're in the kind of, in the locker room with the kind of the speech to psych people up. And I think this is the way I think about the question. Kind of the team talk would be, we know what we need to deliver. We know the outcome we're aiming for, in that case win the match, but ultimately in this case different, and I'll go through each of these in turn. We know the challenges we're going to experience during the course of the next couple of years, or alternatively the next 90 minutes. We know we need an early start, we need to get going quickly, which I think is really important and a good message from the FES this time round. And then critically, the question that then really situates itself beyond that is how bold are we going to be in searching out that outcome? And I think we can all agree that for the majority of the game yesterday that was not the case, but equally, obviously, we know that might be different in the context of the energy transition, which is important. So let me just talk through each of those in turn. Kind of, we know what we need to achieve. I think the FES is really clear this year on exactly what we're aiming for, net zero by 2050, but critically what needs to happen, and then move from broad scenarios to kind of clear pathways which are narrower. It reflects the fact that the outcome we're all seeking to achieve and the technology choices that are there are much clearer now than they ever have been. And I think that's a really positive development, and the FES now plays a more important role in narrowing that, but also giving clarity to politicians and others across government and industry about what that outcome we're all seeking to achieve is. Secondly, we also know what the challenges we're going to experience are, and I think actually, this is not criticism, I think the FES doesn't articulate any new challenges, and in maybe in some ways that's a good thing, because I think across the sector we all know the key challenges we're facing across what's happening with the supply chain, how we're getting closer to the dynamic around strategic planning and local delivery, the issues around the grid investment, all the kind of broad issues that the FES articulates. And critically for us, we know those challenges as we enter into the course of the next transition, particularly over the next 2 years. And so having clarity and the FES alluding to those is really, really important. Connected to that, we ultimately need to know that we need to get going quickly, and I really like this year the fact that the FES focused on the fact that we have 2 years of decisive action to set ourselves up for success. And critically, I think the new government knows that, actually. You've seen more energy in the last week than I think we have maybe in the last year, and that is a really positive outcome, showing that they know they need to get moving forward quickly on urgent issues like technology for onshore wind planning, as well as also critical kind of delivery decisions around solar. And that is a really positive thing, because it shows that we can make action in the near term, even if we're aiming at long-term technology transitions. And I think the FES is a very good way of articulating that. But all of that is positive and good. The real question is, how bold are we going to be about searching out the longer-term outcomes? And I think that's where I'm, back to the question, maybe a little bit more concerned around whether we are willing to carry through the bold, radical policy and political decisions that are going to be needed to deliver on even the kind of more stretching pathways that you set out today. And there's 3 things I pick out in that, and back to the kind of core question. Firstly, are we serious about getting infrastructure built in this country over the time frame that is required? And that requires rethinking planning, rethinking how we do regulation, environmental approvals, as well as critically how we plan the energy system. And that is a really interesting question that the new government is starting to grapple with, and ultimately the FES plays into that because it gives clarity to how quickly you need to build infrastructure. I was struck by the fact that we need to double the renewable capacity in this country by 2030. We need to increase the level of storage by 5 times over the course of the next 6 years compared to what we have today. That is a really significant challenge, and ultimately the blockers to building that infrastructure are probably the thing that will hold us back the most. Secondly, connected to that, connections, and I know this is one of the top things on the list of 8. Clearly, the new government, supported by entities like the ESO and future NESO, will have an important role in doing something radical and transformational on grid connections, because we all know from a supply and demand perspective, those are the areas where we're potentially furthest behind. And so I think that's a very particular focus of this year's FES, and I think that's really important. The final thing, and I think I'm sure we'll get to this when we get into the Q&A, is going beyond the power sector. One of the core messages for FES for me is that you can go as fast as you want on power sector decarbonisation, but unless you solve the transport and heating challenges and then you back solve what that means for your power sector, you're going to find yourself far behind. And that's an area, again, where we're going to need some serious political bravery over the course of the next couple of years. And at this stage, the new government hasn't set out in really significant detail what it will do beyond the power sector. And for me, of all the things that the FES kind of should land with the new ministerial team, the importance of going beyond the power sector into other areas is the key challenge. So I think that's all I was going to say.
Excellent, thank you. Jane?
Well, I definitely am not going to go with the football analogy, but lots of very good things there you've said there, Josh. I won't repeat those. I think there's a couple of things that really struck me as I looked at this. I mean, firstly, I also really appreciate that it underlines the need to make progress over the next 2 years. And so you see in the actions that are required some of those critical decisions that need to happen. We know that storage takes time to put in place. If you want to condition a salt cavern for hydrogen storage, that takes years. It's not a year, it's years to do it. And so some of those decisions do need to be taken within the next 2 years, and we know they're coming up on the agenda. So I very much appreciate that underlining of the next 2 years being critical for decision making. I think the other thing that really strikes you as you look at these scenarios, these pathways, is of course they're not mutually exclusive in the end. It is a spectrum. You put the little chart up there that showed that spectrum, difficult to depict in my opinion, and to really understand how the choices that we make in the next 2 years will impact our ability to land on one or other or close to one or other of those pathways. So this isn't about hydrogen versus electricity. This is about actually what's the best way to get to 2050. You'd electrify wherever you can. And then to underline another point that I think came across very well in this, you use hydrogen, for example, for where it's really critical. So you use it for the difficult to decarbonise, industrial areas. I'll come on to clusters in a minute. You make sure that you are using it for power mitigation, if you like, of those fluctuations. And of course, what you also want to make sure is if you're using it for transport, you're using it for parts of transport where, in fact, it can't be substituted by another means. But it will be necessary in the system. Now, if I looked at the data around the amount of hydrogen that's needed there, it's got a narrower range, actually, than has been in the previous scenarios. I think that's helpful. It just underlines the fact it's going to be a part of the mix, and if something needs to be done, we need to take those appropriate decisions. I want to just mention the industrial clusters because it does come through in the document, but I think it's really important that the new government continues to support the evolution of the industrial clusters. Because when you look at how the spatial planning is going to go, the industrial clusters are absolutely critical in how we put the networks together. And that means in a whole energy system planning. And if I think about the approach to clusters, there are quite some decisions that need to be taken right now around the infrastructure for clusters, and that's both transportation, the storage, what's going to happen about the carbon capture, and then the rollout of the clusters across the UK. So the decisions around Track 1 clusters, the Track 1 extensions, Track 2 clusters are extremely important. And I think that comes through very nicely in the scenarios. And it goes beyond that when you look at skills and the evolution of skills and growth, in fact. So growth of industry isn't mentioned other than in the assumptions really behind this. And I do wonder, as I look at a government that's come in with quite a strong agenda around growth, how this could impact the scenarios going forward and what that might mean. I hope, personally, to see more industrial growth in some of that. And so it would be interesting to see the impact on energy requirements as we look forward. Other impacts, and I think you were keen to emphasise that all this was done really before some of the election changes. I'm delighted that there will be emphasis on putting onshore wind in place and that we're going to really move hard into that renewable energy sector. But I think that can impact the way these pathways evolve, and next year is going to be an extremely interesting set of scenarios as well. So this year, I think, points the way for immediate decisions. You asked about things for the near term. So hydrogen storage, decisions need to get taken on the business model. I've been saying this anyway, there's lots of work going on. But if there were anything that could be done to bring those decisions forward, it would be very, very useful. And that's infrastructure on storage and also for transportation of hydrogen. And if I think about the evolution of the clusters and the HAR1, HAR2 decisions for hydrogen, if you could accelerate those decisions and make sure they happen this year, I think it's vital.
Thank you, Jane.
Oh, sorry, there was one other thing. Not mentioned enough
is the public acceptance of these changes. And of course, it is fundamental to the start scenarios here, but that is the real difficulty, and I think government's got a massive role to play in helping to get the public acceptance of this transition across.
And that's a lovely segue to Jimmy in the smart DCC and enabling infrastructure.
I was going to say that's a very good segue. So my reflections on the pathways, I think it almost positions ESO going to NESO as a statesman, because it's not a hydrogen versus heat. It takes a very holistic picture. It also points to steps to net zero, demand reduction, low carbon generation, and a few other things. But I think the key thing that really struck me from this is how much heavy lifting energy demand, reduction in energy demand is going to be doing across the three pathways. And that speaks to a level of consumer engagement that I don't think we've seen before. So that, for me, is the main thing that struck me. And often the focus is on the supply side, but the level of demand reduction needed shows that there's a need on the demand side as well. So it's not an either or, but both are needed. And I think that's really important. And looking at that, you think there's a huge ambition here. It's going to take a lot in 2 years to get there. Another thing that struck me was across the three scenarios, you need 94 gigawatts of onshore and solar connection connected in 2030. That's 6 years' time. That is very ambitious. But looking at quick wins, I think energy efficiency, like Lauren said, is just a quick win, in my view. And the demand side response as well, so demand flexibility, I think, is another quick win. And my mind goes to winter 23-24 with the DFS. You had just about 2.6 million participants and you achieved 3.7 gigawatts energy saving. So to put that in context, I think the onshore wind capacity at the moment is 15 or thereabout, and you've achieved from just 2.6 million participants, 3.7 gigawatts of energy demand reduction. So that really is important. And for me, a smart DCC where we've designed, built and run the smart metering network, underpinning that actually is a smart metering network. You've got 31 million smart meters connected to the network. We're in 19 million homes, that's over half of British homes. Imagine if you had all those meters playing a part, how much demand reduction would happen in the UK. But broadly, I think it's really fascinating, the pathways. I was going to say scenarios, the pathways, but the challenge is enormous. And you're very right. Within the next 2 years, decisive action has to happen. Otherwise, that counterfactual that shows the other world that could happen if we don't hit net zero could become the reality for Great Britain.
Excellent, thank you. And finally, Rita.
Thank you. But I think when it comes to challenging, I think these pathways show that it is a whole energy approach to the future. It's not an either or on the supply side. It's not electricity or hydrogen, because even in the ones where there's a lean one way or the other, you've still got hydrogen and electricity playing a part, and it's not either or in terms of supply or demand. We need action on both sides of things. And that is very challenging. Like, it's challenging to do the modelling from a whole energy perspective. It's going to be even more challenging to do the delivery from a whole energy perspective. It's going to take a lot of collaboration between the different players, between government, industry, ESO, and as we evolve into NESO, and certainly the public. All of these things come together in places, as the panel have said. We need the public to be on board for the acceptance of new infrastructure. We need the public to be on board to play their part in delivering some of the flexibility that could reduce the need for some of the extremes of that infrastructure. And these are complex systems. The interplay between the systems that exist already between electricity and gas is complex. And we've got new systems developing where we don't quite know what they're going to look like in the future, what sort of market there's going to be in CO2, in hydrogen, and the policy frameworks for those have been enabled now but have not been delivered yet. And as colleagues have said, we need to accelerate some of that. So it's that whole energy delivery challenge that I think is the toughest to think about. And part of that is kind of understanding the roles that we all play in that. And I think that is going to be something that's going to be really important going forward. We've got these narrower pathways. The new government are suggesting that they're going to be much more mission focused. So then it's for all of us to understand what our role in delivering that mission is, so that we can have a collaborative whole system approach to the delivery.
Brilliant, thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Excellent. If you get hold of a mic, maybe, if you could introduce yourself.
Good morning, Dan Heller at Cadent Gas. Firstly, I want to say it's great to see the changes in the FES pathways for 2024 and the changes which have happened since 23 with a slower rollout to reflect the challenges we're facing in the UK economy. With gas now playing a more significant role in the short to medium term to support consumers, what changes do you see needing to happen within UK policy to support our transition to net zero, especially when it comes to consumer uncertainty with space heating and transport challenges are significant? I just want a little bit more information on that, please.
Rita, maybe?
Well, I think it will, as we've already alluded to, we're going to need to see where the new government is coming out on some of the policies that are going to be important for those the wider issues around heating and around transport. I think for the most part, we do know the kinds of actions that need to be taken and the kinds of technologies that need to be rolled out. And I think the key part around that is going to be how bold the government wants to be in incentivising or regulating the moves towards the uptake of new technologies and the roles of certain technologies. And that kind of leads you back to the conversation that they're going to have with the public around that, because there has to be acceptability of the new policies, and affordability of the new policies is going to be really important. So I think we have a broad sense of the policies that are required. How hard you're going to lean and which levers you're really going to lean into will remain to be seen, and we'll have to take some direction from the new government there. And we, as ESO evolving into NESO, will be giving more of our own view from that whole energy perspective as to where those policy levers might need to be pushed.
Great. Anyone else like to add?
I just guess generally on the point I made earlier on, the new government showing great ambition on the kind of power sector, and I think kind of the nub of your question is the right one. What is actually then the policy and regulatory framework that will then exist beyond that in heat and transport to deliver then the broader transition, which the FES focuses on, and that there is much less clarity. There's a lot of positive things on things like energy efficiency, and the point was made earlier around that being a low regrets thing is obvious, but what you're actually going to do to drive the targets that are set out effectively by signing up to the 5th and 6th carbon budget, at the moment the policy framework is relatively bare, and obviously they've also suggested some quite radical change in things like transport, which haven't necessarily kind of come through yet, so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. The one other area just on gas generally, which I know is less a kind of distribution but more a transmission issue, which I'm interested to watch, is how they treat gas within the power sector, because obviously there's been a big and bold statement of intent on the 2030 target, and I think I'm right in saying that the FES documents published today don't necessarily get to a kind of zero carbon power sector by 2030, and so how the new government will think about the role of gas within the power sector, both unabated and abated over time, will be really interesting to watch, because clearly obviously that will have an impact on the 2030 mission, but also potentially on the utilisation of gas elsewhere and other things like, for example, hydrogen storage, which Jane mentioned, which obviously are the kind of medium-term outcome that needs to happen to actually evolve the system in a more zero-carbon orientated direction.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have one down at the front here, and then two on this row actually, so if you could just...
Chris Twin, on the governance board of the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard for buildings, which we're trying to come up with a unified standard within the industry. I'm very interested in the energy efficiency side of things. And I'm aware that effectively the advice from the Climate Change Committee, if one's looking at existing buildings, is a very modest 12% improvement across the stock, which doesn't really get us very far and is almost pitched to the level where you don't need to engage the end users. I think all of us realise that's got to change. So the question is, how much further is that going than the advice from Climate Change Committee within FES pathways? And in particular, the move from national targets to peak targets on the basis that something like 40% of the future grid is likely to have to serve the heating component of buildings, which is very transitional, as opposed to the annual targets. Now, that is arguably a big thing we've hardly even started talking about.
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on energy efficiency?
Well, I'll just say one thing, because I was really struck when I read the document that there was a comment there about if you just insulated and made the behavioural change, you can achieve 39%.
39%,
yeah. You had the
That's
same.
stop use, yeah.
I saw it and thought, well, that's great. You know, why wouldn't you just crack on and do that? To Rita's point as well. So why wouldn't you do that? I think on the wider comment on that, I'll leave it to one of my more expert panellists to comment. But
I think
there is something around
I'll pick
there.
up on what Jane said about energy efficiency there. And I think, if you take smart metering data, for example, and one of the things I would like to see more of is the ease of access to energy data, because you've got insights from smart metering data. We get, on a monthly basis, 2 billion messages pass across the smart metering network. And we're working with Greater London Authority and Greater Manchester Combined Authority on the use of smart metering data for their retrofit and local area energy plans. But take your energy performance certificate, for example. By the time you add some other, information, you've got sensors and things on the network, you get a more accurate picture of what's needed to retrofit a building with smart metering data. So I guess what I'm saying is energy efficiency is a low win, but you've got smart data that's existing already you can actually make use of if you just, were able to access that more readily. That could actually help on with the existing stock, but with future stock, come 2025, you've got the future homes and buildings. And your facial reaction says you've got something to say on that one, but you've got that coming in. You've got that coming in for new buildings from 2025.
There is an interesting point, isn't there, around just the historic volume and use of data in the energy industry, and just how the attitudes towards data need to change, both to ensure that consumers are protected, but to enable it to be used, because it will unlock a lot of the things that need to move forward. Absolutely,
and so with our bit, it's anonymized data that we get. But there is something about an awareness campaign, actually, and that that addresses that point. What's my data being used for? How is it being used? So there's work to be done there to reassure consumers. But we want innovation. So one of the actions, the 5th action, is around smart insights unlock innovation. And from what we see at DCC, I won't mention the company, but there are companies that are already using our innovation labs to test smart home technologies that will, that can save consumers about 20% on their bills annually. But without the data being readily available, the innovation may not happen as quickly as we need it to happen.
And you mentioned DFS earlier, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a demand flexibility service that's run for the last 2 winters. That is very superficial on data and tech, isn't it? Because it very much depends on getting a message and then going and programming devices yourself. And if you can, as you say, if you can make that data open access and create the environment for innovation, then those things will fly.
Yeah. I was just going to add that I think energy efficiency is an area where supply chain and skills is really critical, and is perhaps not an area that leaps to mind when people are thinking about those challenges in the energy system. And I think that some really clear policy signals from the government are going to be really critical in encouraging and giving confidence to the UK housing sector and insulation to to get ready to be able to deliver very quickly, given some of the ebbs and flows there have been in policy in that space over the last 10, 15 years.
Thank you. This gentleman here.
Thanks very much. I'm Tegid Wyn Jones. I am 17 years ago, I left UCL on my first sell-by date. And ever since then, I've been looking at every British energy scenarios that's existed. And I'd like to thank Lauren for remembering about the Sankey plots. Yeah. The question I'd like to ask is the following. You were all leaders of the UK's attempt to get to net zero. Now, do you know in your own minds, the present energy generation is 35 gigawatts, and do you know what are your estimates that you will get, what will it be in 2050, and how much hydrogen you need in terawatt hours per year to store to ensure a reliable electricity system? Now, I know I haven't read the report, actually, but I asked you, clearly have read the report, so I asked that question.
Sure.
Maybe I'll reposition that slightly to looking ahead to the task of 2050 and net zero, and is it feasible to have the level of storage from hydrogen and other technologies?
What is your estimate of that storage required in terawatt hours per year?
So actually, there is something in the report.
I was
about
going to
this.
say.
And no, but let me let me give you. So I've got it in gigawatts because I was pressing. So I think in gigawatts, which is just probably mad in a forum like this. Why do I think in gigawatts? It's because I've just been thinking about various hydrogen scenarios. But for example, so here we go. For the holistic transition, by 2050, so I can give you 2035, 12 gigawatts of hydrogen, and then there's a graph. There's a graph here in the document,
okay,
which
I'm pointing out immediately that there's a Royal Society report,
Yeah.
which has used 37 years of weather data,
Yeah.
and their estimate is 120 terawatt hours
okay.
of storage required. It's just that I feel that on all these discussions, they should be quantitative.
Okay. So we could.
You know,
Yeah,
whenever
you're right.
you present things, you should be able to do it in a quantitative manner as well.
Okay, message received, and if you give me a moment, I could find the graph, but because it's quite far back. But there is some quantification here, which is really helpful. And to your point, Claire, about how do you, is it feasible? So the hydrogen quantitatively, the hydrogen scenarios have been very, very wide. So they range from sort of almost no hydrogen whatsoever to about 72 gigawatts of hydrogen, which is a huge amount, okay? And if you consider that the UK's hydrogen strategy has within it a desire to get to 10 gigawatts of hydrogen by 2030, which is due to be split 50-50, sort of roughly electrolytic and CCUS. That's a massive sort of change that you're looking at. And so is this feasible? Well, electrolytic hydrogen at the moment isn't deployed anywhere in the world at gigawatt scale. So it's a big challenge to get there. However, if you invest and take the decisions about deployment, it will scale up and you will be able to get to large quantities. I would have a question mark about the split in the hydrogen evolution scenario, about the feasibility of that. That does depend more on a blue hydrogen with carbon capture statistic. But basically, I think that the electrolytic hydrogen is quite challenging there. However, each of these scenarios, in theory, is, because they're pathways rather than scenarios, is feasible.
And I think Josh, you said the point earlier that FES this year doesn't necessarily introduce any new challenges. The challenges are known and the technologies are known, and it is really around understanding the scale of that challenge, and then what do you need to believe to unlock that, and then what needs to be done in that next 2 years to really get these things moving.
And what I like as well in the scenario is you do point out about some of the up and coming technologies, but they're not bedded into the pathways that you've expressed here, but they may of course impact in the future, which I think is really well highlighted. and is going to be quite important, again, as you look at it in a data-driven fashion, which will be important for the decisions.
And I just on the kind of the quantification issues, and I've said this to quite a few of our energy ministers over the course of the last decade, kind of pinpointing exactly what the kind of numbers will be in 2050, that the FES obviously attempts to do, but does it in a kind of relatively broad way, is unlikely to reflect the reality of what's likely to evolve. Technology moves on, sectors change. That will be true of hydrogen, of electricity, of different technologies. The thing that I think is more interesting in the FES in reality is the near term. So I think on the storage side, the assumption is built in that storage levels need to increase 5 times over the course of the next 6 years compared to where they are now, and that's obviously a range of different storage technologies. That's a really significant growth rate, and that gives you a kind of, that's probably, you're much more certain about what the numbers in 2030 need to look like than in 2050, and are we really set up to deliver that sort of storage growth beyond just kind of short-term duration batteries? I don't think anyone on the panel will probably take that view at this stage. So the opportunities has been mentioned around demand side flexibility, the requirements around other forms of long duration energy storage. All of that feels to me the one big priority that the current government hasn't quite got to yet, but they will come back to it when they look at some of the operability issues, as well as obviously some of the system challenges. So I think kind of some of those quantification questions in the short term are as important as in the long term.
Thank you. This lady down at the front. Maybe this one and then that lady. She can.
Thank you very much. Beanland Heat Pump Federation. I'm very interested in this conversation with consumers because our previous Prime Minister called for a conversation with consumers in October in his speeches in September and October and then didn't have it. So my question is, whose responsibility is it to have these conversations with consumers? How honest do we need to be? And I think we need to be completely honest. And how do we ensure that that messaging to consumers is consistent? Because we're working from a history where consumers are very, very dubious. I was talking to a friend of mine about doing cavity wall insulation, for example, this weekend, and he says absolutely not. No one would insure him if he fills the cavities in his house. So we do have a problem with energy efficiency where there is real doubt in consumers' minds as to whether or not these technologies and these improvements to energy efficiency will deliver without causing damage to the fabric of the buildings. And we've seen, I spent time in New Zealand where they had what they called sick building syndrome caused by poor attempts to improve fabric. So I think we need to have a really honest and grown-up conversation. But I'm worried about how we do that consistently, given the number of actors there are who will be having these conversations, including ourselves, of course.
Thank you.
So, that's a very interesting question, and definitely we need to have that conversation with consumers. And I will draw on another experience. So in another life, in another role, I did work on heat decarbonisation, and I was involved in a piece of research talking to consumers actually about the energy transition. And one of the things, and I think it's flagged in the pathways actually, is what's important for consumers is independent advice they trust. They don't want, the research, they didn't want to hear it from government. They wanted other sources away from government, was what that research said. So they mentioned the likes of, I'm not making policy here, by the way, but from that research, they talked about a regulator, a consumer organization. I know there's citizens' advice, there are other charities involved in the consumer space as well. But that independence, they wanted to trust what they heard, and the body delivering the message was important for that trust, I guess is the point there. And the level of advice, and there wasn't any aversion to net zero from those people. They were willing to make the changes, but they just wanted the advice they got to be independent and something they could trust. And the body that delivers that message is really important. So I guess, that gives you a framework in terms of how we can engage with consumers on energy efficiency, if that helps.
We're meeting consumer groups at the rate of about once a fortnight at the moment, and the hunger is enormous. Sorry. So we're meeting with consumer groups, as I say, about an average about once a fortnight at the moment. Some are relatively small groups. Some, I think the biggest we've done so far is about 800 people. The appetite for information is enormous. The willingness to get involved is, I think, huge. I think we're in danger of underestimating the willingness of consumers to participate. They want to be known. They want to know how to participate, and they want people to recognise the changing requirements. So there's a lot of talk now about cooling requirements. You know? There's a lot of talk about higher temperature requirements. We're seeing now developments for plus 55-year-olds. They're demanding 23 degrees in their home, throughout the home, all the time. You know, where I was staying this weekend, the heating was on because it wasn't 22 degrees in the home, and they were in their 80s. So there is a real change coming, I think, in what consumers are demanding and expecting, and I don't think we're getting anywhere close to understanding that yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kate Mulvaney from Cornwall Insight, an independent consultancy firm. I would like to ask the panel about their views on wholesale energy market reform. So we've had REMA, the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements. We're about 2 years in now without the prior government making any firm decisions. I think it was fair to say we're on a pathway for capacity market reform, contract for difference reform. I think conceptually those are widely accepted, and as a potential but to be proven on the table remained the locational marginal pricing zonal regional option. Now, with the doubling down of and the very firm 2030 net zero target, is there capacity to run essentially two potentially competing massive programmes of reform in the GB electricity system? The decarbonisation piece as a pure objective on its own, and then secondly, introducing potentially wholesale market reform. So can we hit net zero by 2030 within the electricity system, and also can we pursue regional or zonal locational marginal pricing?
Who would like to take that one? Oh, Rita.
Well, I think the questions around it's around sort of understanding what might need to happen to do those things and what you need to believe, and then that kind of judges your level of boldness as we were, that informs the level of boldness that you need to be taking. I think market reform is important in any world. It was important before, and it will be again for reaching net zero power by 2030. Some of you may have seen last week that the government have set out an intention to ask ESO NESO to provide thoughts on how you would do that. And I think we will be thinking carefully about what needs to happen around planning, around connections, around infrastructure build out, around market reform and other areas. And at the heart of that will very much be what is it that you need to believe. And some of these questions around the capacity to be able to do these huge heaves over a short period of time will be some of the things that we're looking at there.
Go on, Josh.
No, if you were going to cover.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, some people know that this is my hobby project. Maybe if I just take it right to step back, which I think we sometimes forget to do in the REMA debate because it very quickly gets very complex. The wholesale market, as it is currently designed, is designed to incentivise participants to balance supply and demand. In a renewables system, the thing that needs sorting out is the physics of the system. The supply and demand, you're generally, not all the time, going to be in excess of supply. And it's the physics, and there are no signals sent to market participants at the minute to that effect. We've also got to consider that with everything that we've talked about so far this morning on the panel, most of the supply side in the 2030s is going to be operating under some kind of subsidy. So whether it is just a CM contract, or it's a cap and floor, or you've got plant in a strategic reserve, and a marginal price system operating when everything is under a subsidy probably isn't the most efficient. And I think we have to, regardless of what the answer is in terms of the flavour of reform, I think we do need to acknowledge that the market is designed today for a different physical system than the one that's going to exist in the 2030s.
I agree. I don't think there's no fundamental reason why you can't both reform the market to boost deployment in the near term, whilst also dealing with the kind of systematic market changes and the physics changes that are going to come through. That is a tension, but clearly you can still do both, and we've done that in the past. EMR is a good example of that. The key thing, though, to mitigate that, for me, to make sure you get the balance right, is firstly, timeframes. So are we realistically going to deliver some of the more radical reforms immediately, or are we giving certainty that we'll do it at some stage, but ultimately we'll develop towards that? And then secondly, how do you treat existing assets who have made investments in a certain world and paradigm that has changed? And that's a difficult value for money equation, and kind of something the government thinks through very regularly, but those two things will then help you make decisions. What that also potentially then helps you do is make a decision to give some clarity in the near term, because the worst thing you can do for both kind of delivery certainty and market change is have another 2 years of this hanging over the sector. And I think we all kind of collectively agree that some sort of decision and clarity on the pathway forward is what's most needed in the next kind of 6 to 12 months.
Thank you. We've got 2 questions over here, and then I'm going to go up to the back. So the gentleman just behind, and then...
Thanks very much. Chris Hume, I'm the chair of ADBA, the Green Gas Industry Association. Just really welcome the injection of more economics into the pathways. And I just wonder if you can clarify how much has been injected, particularly if you look at what I suspect is going to be the biggest economic cost, which is the interseasonal swing in the electricity grid from July through to January. How confident are you beginning to be about the likely costs that are associated with that? And I'm particularly thinking of that because obviously hydrogen has been talked about as the big swing factor. But if you're looking at the storage elements, biomethane can actually do the job much more cheaply and using a lot of the assets we've got already.
Take that if you... As you say, this year in FES, we have started to integrate greater economic modelling. It's not fully costed and it's not fully comprehensive, but it is a good step forward. And as you say, the main benefit so far has actually been really highlighting some of the trade-offs that we knew were in there, but exactly as you outline. Where that's got us to this year is creating a framework that has taken into account the economic considerations, but actually what we've heard through the stakeholder engagement as well, because if you look at things on a straight economic cost model, it sometimes delivers answers that are not feasible. So it's early stage at the minute, but one of the big, which will be talked about in the documents, is one of the big transitions for FES for future years is to fully cost it and to evolve to a much more comprehensive economic assessment. And we've actually set up, as part of our transition to NESO, we have set up an Office of Chief Economist within the ESO now to support with that.
Can I just have a quick supplementary on that?
You can, but you need a mic.
Which is just that, if you're asking a government, policymakers, to make some serious decisions over the next 2 years, and the costs have not been laid out, that's a bit like asking ministers to go shopping in a supermarket without price tags.
I agree. You need to lay out costs. You also need to recognise the impact on local communities and other things. There's lots of factors that will be tied into the policy decisions. And yes, as Rita mentioned, part of our role in providing advice will be to lay out the facts for the decision makers to make the policy decisions. Behind, and then I'm going to come up to the back here.
Good morning, thank you. Really enjoying your conversation. It's Charles Perkins from ITM Power. So we're a manufacturer of electrical equipment in Sheffield. Now, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of supply of precious metals, materials for, copper, for example, you're looking at a global situation in terms of net zero, competition for resources, and the whole prime focus of the UK in this rush to net zero, and what technologies it chooses that takes into account the availability of those precious metals. They're becoming increasingly rare in terms of quality and availability. the global supply chain. And I think this is the thing that this concerns me personally about the whole drive to net zero and how it's being approached. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the cost and the risk and affordability that we're going to have to decide on within the next 2 years, pick and choose technologies, when there's so much development taking place. I mean, I saw your allusion to, well, we're going to go blue hydrogen. I mean, the green hydrogen electrolysis technology and advances that are taking place are just incredible at the moment, and the costs are coming down. It's an industry that's grown from a cottage industry that is now standardizing for industrial manufacturing, and that needs supporting in the UK. You know, we've got to look at UK technologies, UK manufacturers, preparing those manufacturers for this big opportunity, whilst taking into consideration this very constrained resource situation we're facing. So my question is that being addressed in your report that I haven't read?
Okay, thank you. Can I just take the question behind as well, and then we'll answer both of them?
Thanks. Matt Hindle from Wales and West Utilities. All of you have talked about the sort of boldness and speed of decisions required for these pathways, and I think we've kind of naturally gravitated so far towards what's in the sort of incoming government's in tray in those sort of decisions. I wondered if you could comment on the kind of links between national decision making and devolved regional, local levels of decision making. Do you see any priorities, any tensions there? What does it mean for the institutional frameworks that we have, and perhaps how they're resourced as well?
Okay, thank you. So 2 questions there. One about probably the supporting supply chain, supplies and materials, particularly around precious metals and things like that, whether that is factored in, and then links between national and devolved decision making.
So I'd love to make some comments on the precious metals bit, which I will in a minute, but I didn't know if you wanted to comment on whether the extent to which it's been included in the scenario work or the pathway work. So within the document, it isn't mentioned specifically, okay? And I don't know what's behind that, and I'm sure one of the team later could answer the question. But I think there's a couple of points I'd make to your question. So firstly, the electrolytic hydrogen demand is going to grow significantly in whatever scenario, which is very important. Secondly, it is clear that the technology for electrolytic hydrogen is evolving, and I would expect costs to go down significantly. On critical resources, the UK has got a list of critical materials and is taking that into account in looking at policy overall, and that often sits within the science thread, the sort of science department, etc. But that's quite well understood. I did see some data just last week actually, which analysed the overall availability and requirements for certain critical materials, copper, precious metals, platinum group metals, etc. And in fact, there isn't as much shortage globally as one thinks. But of course, as ever, it's always about timing and where some of the other risks are, because a lot of these resources sit in places which are difficult to extract whilst also observing all the appropriate ethical practices that one would hope for. So there are aspects to consider. I didn't see reference to those critical materials in there. However, I don't think that should be constraining those scenarios. I think there are other things that are more likely to constrain the ability to get to net zero, if I look at this.
Yeah, spot on. With it being a stakeholder-led process, it's constrained to the extent that the inputs that we receive constrain it, if that makes sense. So we wouldn't constrain based on a view. That is different to advice we may give in if we are asked specific questions, but in terms of the scenarios, we wouldn't go that deep into whether we believe critical, individual assumptions. Josh, you were going to add?
Yeah, just one point that maybe I'll come to the devolution question. Just on the underlying your point, I thought you made an interesting kind of observation around the importance of technology innovation and avoiding picking winners to the extent that you then limit that technology innovation. And one of the things the new government has talked about a lot is giving a clearer steer, driving forward activity. The danger of that is that they then centralise and you're then in a position where you don't get that natural technology evolution that comes through. So there is, I still think, a question, I'm sure this is picked up in the FES, about how you account for that innovation and how do you avoid a situation where, for example, new battery materials that could potentially deal with some of the kind of precious minerals issues are not allowed to come through the system because you've already chosen your technology pathways for the next 30 years. And that feels to me like a really important balance the new government's got to set. Just on the national devolution, national versus kind of local decision-making question, it's like the easiest thing in the world is for a politician to say, we believe in local decision-making, devolution. It's kind of, they all say it, they don't really mean it in practice. The thing which I think is important is to distinguish between the decisions that need to be made at a national perspective and those that are best made at a local level. So some examples, like at a national level, clearly the approach to grid connections and transmission and distribution investment clearly has to be a national decision. Equally, planning reform probably has to be a national decision, notwithstanding obviously different settlements on planning in the devolved administrations. Set against that, things like energy efficiency planning, we've talked about it before, there's potentially a much bigger role for local areas in that context, as we've already seen in the devolved administrations. The point Jay made earlier on industrial planning and decarbonisation, that should not be done at a national level because they don't know and don't understand the regions and the specific challenges that they create. So I think the more interesting question is less the kind of balance across the broad spectrum, it's more about which issues fall best in which areas, and a government that thinks that through in a thoughtful way could actually have a real impact in terms of the pace of delivery at a local level.
And just a reminder that as NESO, we're going to be thinking about things both from the strategic national level and the regional level in the way that we do planning. And the document sets out how FES is going to be an input into strategic planning. And there'll be strategic spatial energy planning that will be looking at those really significant bits of national infrastructure on the supply and demand side that will inform transmission network planning, and we'll feed into that stuff that's happening on a detailed basis with the centralised network strategic plan. Yes, and then the regional energy spatial planning, which Ofgem are doing detailed design on at the moment, where the intent is for NESO to have presence in the number of regions that is settled on in the end, and to do much more of that bottom-up thinking about what makes sense in those places, taking the inputs from the strategic and the national planning, and working with a range of local actors to think about how that plan is going to be developed for that region and reflect the needs of that region.
I was just going to say, just building on what Josh said earlier, potentially, I totally agree with everything Josh has said, but potentially what government could do is have a framework, to ensure consistency in delivery. So there's an overarching national framework which the local and devolved areas work to ensure consistency in delivery. That's just the other bit I'd add to what Josh said.
Thank you. Here, so there's one at the back and then one 4 rows before, and then lady in the red top there. So maybe if we take all three of those questions, if that's okay.
First of all, thank you everyone for the work you've been doing in the community. But I just had a question because I'm from Citizens Advice, and we come across a lot of clients who live in properties with an EPC of D and below. And a lot of these people are from fuel poverty areas as well. So we have a lot of grants. We have Eco4, GBIS, HUG2, a lot of these different grants that are easily accessible. But the only issue with these is we haven't come across a lot of people who've got the funding required to have insulation done to their properties. So one of the ways that the EPC increases, they just put in like heating controls or things like that, which don't really improve the insulation of the property. So is there any sort of maybe policy or something that can be done? And has the FES looked into this as well as to how things can proceed going forward?
Okay, thank you. And then just in front with the...
Hi, Gillian Williamson, Northern Power Grid. I'd like to ask the panel, we've heard today lots of things that need doing, but if you get the elevator pitch, the 2 minutes with Chris Stark on mission control, what killer fact are you going to give him and what priority are you going to ask him for? Thank you.
Ooh. And then just to find...
Right, Jane won't be surprised that this question is about hydrogen. You mentioned all the several different requirements for hydrogen for difficult to decarbonise, but of course there's one sector, and it's not technically classified as energy use, which is impossible to electrify, which of course is industrial use of hydrogen. We use about 700,000 tonnes in the UK at the moment, the last time I checked, which if it was green hydrogen, would use up roughly 50 gigawatts of electrolyser capacity. And my calculations say we should be doing that before we use hydrogen for any sort of heating applications, because the gain in the reduction in CO2 emissions is significantly better using it for that. So should there be a tie-up between the industrial use of hydrogen and non-industrial use?
Okay. Thank you. So that was, is there some kind of policy or action needed to ensure, I'm going to paraphrase horribly, but a proper rollout of efficiency, so grants and things are targeted where they can make the most impact? What would be your elevator pitch to Chris Stark? And does policy needed to be tie up, say, very similar to the first one, say that applications of hydrogen are targeted where they have the best or the greatest impact?
I can take the fuel poverty one. So that's really important. And if I go back to the work that we've done internally in Smart DCC, so taking smart metering data, we've partnered with another organization and created an AI app, U0, and that actually helps identify geographical areas that are in or at risk of fuel poverty. And what that does is, we know that funds are scarce, public finances are tight. And what that does actually is it helps with more targeted intervention. And that's a bit of the work that we're doing with local authorities to help them target intervention and their local area energy planning. And that speaks to the bit about energy efficiency as well, and EPCs. So that's sort of the work we're doing with smart metering. So there are things there to help.
Hydrogen.
So shall I talk about hydrogen? Absolutely. We should be prioritising hydrogen for where it can make the most impact, and difficult to decarbonise industry, and also where it's being used today. And in fact, actually, this is precisely what the pathways do say. The second thing is, of course, because of the whereas hydrogen's already used, you'd actually also want to have your carbon capture and storage in place. And it's just so important to get right. And it's really important that that's in place and being deployed by 2030. So absolutely, you prioritise according to the most impact. I think that's going to be part of the decision making that's critical.
And would that form part of your elevator pitch into Chris?
Oh, well, just to speed us up on the answers, yes, why not? No, but of course, I think, yeah. So you prioritise hydrogen where it's going to go. You'd make sure your carbon capture and storage is in place, and you absolutely sort out your storage and transport business models. But I would also support a number of the other things that are going on. I'm sure we'll have some very interesting elevator pitches for Chris.
On Chris, I kind of first thing would say, are you sure you're happy with the name Mission Control? It seems a bit Star Trek to me, but parking that.
He's probably okay with that.
Exactly. Grid connections, that's the thing which we do a lot of work with big investors into the UK who see now grid connections as a European issue in particular, but it's particularly pronounced in the UK as a big constraint. There's people who have money, they want to invest, there's projects that are there that are both kind of delivered without subsidy and with, and grid connections is becoming the big issue, including actually not just on the supply but also on the demand side. So anyone wanting to build a data centre, anyone wanting to build an EV supercharging station, those are really the issues that are then starting to become more prevalent. So I think that feels to me the one message that FES would take away, the thing that they can then try and solve over the next year, including being bold on legislation, potentially taking some legal risk as well. Just on the only other point I was going to make was just on the energy efficiency question. The really interesting change now we've got a government with a majority over 170 is they can be bold when it comes to regulation. And subsidy is only ever going to get you so far. What are they going to do when it comes to regulating the private rented sector, other sectors in terms of trying to boost energy performance? It's politically challenging, even with a big majority. But now you've got a government that has a mandate. It feels like the one area they should look at again. And then you can link that potentially to the provision of subsidy, especially at a local level, to potentially do more transformational retrofits rather than just kind of instantaneous subsidy around limiting deployment. That feels to me an area that they should be looking at quite hard.
Elevator pitch?
I mean, quite selfishly, for us, my elevator pitch to Chris Stark is going to be around the fact that ESO is being created in order to bring real practical experience into the wider energy landscape, and that he should definitely partner with us on a lot of the thinking that's going forward.
Yeah. My elevator pitch would be, like a former minister said, the future of energy is smart. So, like someone I know says, you can't generate your way out of you can't generate your way to net zero. You need a smart energy system.
I think so. But then, as I listened to it, so we all come with our different pieces, and of course, mission control. And yeah, wouldn't it be great to change that name? Actually, of course, what you want is impact, and I guess that's the biggest thing. Actually, back to this 2-year decision point. Don't sit looking for perfection. Just get on with some of the steps that need to be taken. It's not all going to be right at the end of the day, and try to think beyond the 5 years. Because energy planning is strategic. In this context that we have today, it's strategic.
Completely agree. Thank you. Right, we'll go over here. So we've got a gentleman at the front, then one behind, and then a gentleman in the blue shirt there. So these three.
Bismarck analysis. Does the panel have a view on politically what might happen to public consent for all of this if prices stay at this kind of like very elevated level, both relative to historic norms and relative to other major developed economies over the next 3-4 years, or go higher still as obviously try to make progress and ramp up investment levels.
Okay, thank you. And then there's 2 ways behind us.
Hi, Rita Shaw, UK Power Networks. Question for ESO, but also the wider panel. Taking us back to the pathways and particularly holistic transition, how is ESO interpreting that, and how do we think stakeholders should interpret it? Is it a cost optimised pathway? Is it a middle ground? Is it our highest consumer engagement? Yeah, how do we use that new type of pathway in the best way?
Okay. And then just in the middle there, in the blue shirt.
Good morning. Firstly, thank you for a really interesting discussion. I'm Richard Arnold from the Marine Energy Council. So one request for the ESO. Firstly, it's great to see tidal stream featured in the report. It'd be even better if that was sort of separated, tidal stream and tidal range, because they're very distinct technologies. But my question is in regards to the UK's relationship with the EU and the sort of assumptions that come into this, with interconnection and a potential introduction of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which could potentially change the assumptions around how much interconnection we might have in the future here. And so within the 2 years, does this report sort of consider the impact of the UK's relationship with the EU and perhaps combining the UK's ETS with the EU so we actually avoid interconnection getting that levy in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so views on public levels of public consent if prices stay high or start going up again. Probably one for you, Rita, on FES pathways and how we should interpret them, and then the relationship with the EU. Who would like to start?
I can start on the political consent piece. It's a bit of a double-edged sword in some ways, because if prices stay high, the argument around investment in domestic renewables in particular becomes stronger, because it gives you both price stability but potentially also some price protection in the event of further gas price spikes, a point that Lauren made at the outset, I think. And critically, obviously, that then gives you the ability to then argue that over time, actually, the UK will become a more competitive economy, which then potentially plays into other economic factors like inflation. It's the positive message that the previous government, as well as the new government, are trying to land. So the argument that if you do see prices increased, even if the kind of economics improve for renewables, the public debate will still be very difficult, potentially cause more issues around the delivery of that infrastructure in the near term, especially where things rely on planning. The other particular challenge, I think, if prices stay high, is it becomes harder and harder to talk to customers in a fair way around the heating transition in particular, as well as obviously the EV transition, because the cost of living crisis will continue. There'll be a big challenge around people's acceptability of large-scale investments up front, even if there's good technology that's coming through and different financing models that are coming through. So for me, the bit that becomes harder, as we've seen over the course of the last 2 years, linked back to the statements that the previous Prime Minister made, are the kind of the higher the cost of living, the harder the bigger changes we need to see in in heating and transport become. And that is my real worry if prices stay high and don't kind of normalise again.
Any other thoughts? I think it's pulled out quite nicely. Actually.
Yeah.
The pathways, there's some good commentary on it. And Chris, as you say, it's very difficult to overcome the affordability question. So there's a lot of logic that we could talk about because we're all into the numbers and the logic of the total system. But the reality of somebody sitting there is really struggling to pay the bills or make other choices is they really probably don't care less actually about that change. So there's a lot to understand, and it's back to the whole public debate. I was talking to somebody who was a not-for-profit and had conducted focus groups with 13-year-olds about green jobs. So this is the skills challenge. What's a green? Wouldn't you like to be in green jobs? Well, actually, no. That means clearing up other people's waste. And this just shows that there's a lot to. We can talk very generically, but it's important that there's a lot of education and understanding across multiple generations and to the whole population. So I think this is really tough. The only other thing I'd say is it depends what's driving the high energy prices as well, because we've seen in some countries and in some places where there's obviously been the war in Ukraine, quite some behavioural changes actually about the way that people are heating their homes and the average temperature that people are prepared to live at. And again, to the point made earlier about the average temperature that there is in the UK and the assumptions you made here about 20 degrees, I think it is, and going down to 19 degrees. These are quite important things and can make quite a big difference actually to energy efficiency. So there's some good comments, I think, in the report about that.
Relationship with EU? Anyone?
I think it's something we're really alive to in ESO, and as we transition to NESO, we have a programme of engagement with our European and international partners. We understand that there are key countries where our relationships are going to be really important, particularly around the North Sea. And we want to work really closely with the government to ensure that we are, understanding the way that the government's relationship is changing and what that might mean for what we're doing. But, we know that we need to be interacting with our energy counterparts on practical steps and those things. And the issues around CBAM, we have work that we are, people looking at those issues now, and they'll be the kinds of things that we'll be providing more advice to government and to industry over time.
So can I just make a couple of comments on that? So firstly, the carbon price is one of the things that does affect sort of bankability of lots of projects. So it's quite an important topic. There are quite a lot of discussions with, of course, the EU about various things. There's collaboration with Germany on hydrogen, for example, at the moment, which is very helpful and productive, I think. And what's interesting here is about the interconnectors and the pathways that show the UK being a net exporter of energy into the future. And I think that poses some questions, again, around the way the economic models will be set up within the UK. Because if you're in a picture where there's a lot of subsidy or a lot of support needed, and it comes back to your hobby, perhaps, a little bit, your side hobby, how do you do that, and how do you set that up in a way where ultimately we would be an energy exporter? What does that mean in terms of economic benefit for the investment that's being put in by the UK, and what's coming to the UK? I don't know the answer to any of that. I'd be very interested in different perspectives on that in a world where these pathways show quite a shift, I think.
Yes, thank you. And then how to interpret pathways?
So on holistic transition, which is the fastest moving, what we're assuming there is that you've got a mixed approach on the technologies, where you're doing the heavy lean into electrification of heat and transport, and you've got hydrogen being used primarily around industrial clusters, where we would expect it to be growing out of. And there is a big lean in there to demand flexibility, which suggests again that there is that engagement. So you've got high levels of public engagement in that, and some of the challenges that we've been talking around earlier. So that's what the holistic transition one is really focused on. It's mixed technologies, high levels of engagement, a strong lean into demand side flexibility.
And just as Lauren was saying earlier, with the move to pathways and away from scenarios, rather than it being a wide range of all the possible that could happen, it is more constrained. So we, apart from the counterfactual, the pathways are constrained to solve to carbon budgets.
Yeah.
So it's it has come narrow, but I say there are plenty of people here, I'm sure, who will be really happy to talk that through. Right, so I'm going to take two more questions. So there's two over on this side, if that's okay, if we take both of those.
Hi, Stuart Waters from the North Sea Transition Authority. I was wondering what the panel's views would be on the priorities of GB Energy when it's formed, because it's going to be done at pace. We know very little about it's going to be an investment vehicle, high capital projects, local energy, but apart from that, the remit focus hasn't really been defined, so it'd be good to get the panel's thoughts on that.
Thank you. And then just at that.
Thank you. Sam Reeves, Senior Energy Consultant at ERM. So in the pathways, a lot of the thinking and the modelling will have happened before an election was even called. Is there anything in particular that you would really want to change had you give it just a little bit more time in your pathways? Is there something that you think, this sector actually, our pathways should be a bit more ambitious now that we have this new government, or other international changes that have happened since the modelling has happened?
Excellent. So priorities for GB Energy, and what would we change in first?
I'm happy to come in on GB Energy, and I'm going to dodge the question immediately. I think the bigger question than the design of GB Energy, I'll come back to that, is you've got a system now, and the governance of the energy system is very complex. There's a whole range of different players who are involved in delivery, implementation, strategic planning. The development of NESO is clearly a positive, but adds another complex entity into a governance arrangement. Chris Stark's mission control, where does that fit into then the rest of government and obviously the department? So for me, the first question of the new government is how do they design governance frameworks for delivery of the 2030 mission and beyond that actually deliver against that and have clear lines of accountability, responsibilities, kind of linked to who has agency, like Ofgem or alternatively government. That's the question to answer. Once you've mapped out kind of where you think the organisations need to sit, what are the capabilities then aren't filled that potentially then creates a gap for GB Energy? I personally don't see a world where there is a gap on the financing side, because you've already got a UK investment bank, you've got a set of innovation agencies, you've also got a shed load of private investment that's flowing into this space. But there are areas where there are potentially market failures, including on kind of more complex technologies, potentially that are further up the innovation curve. So maybe there is a gap there. And potentially, obviously, there is a role when it comes to the development of a kind of coordinated kind of strategy for dealing with cross-cutting challenges like supply chain. So in this country, we don't have any real capability around HVDC cabling to deliver all the grid investment that we need. Could there be a role for GB Energy in pulling that together, for example? And therefore, potentially a convening role could be an interesting thing. But I come back to the point, you need to sort out the rest of the governance framework first before you then create a new entity that then becomes another complex kind of organisation within that cluster.
Yeah, I think there was some commentary during the election campaign about what it might mean for NESO. We were encouraged to see, as part of the announcements around Chris Stark being mission controller last week, that the government committed to establishing NESO with the powers and the roles that were set out in the Energy Act. And that was encouraging because we did see cross-party support for NESO during the passage of that legislation. I think I'd agree with Josh that potentially it is that convening role on some of those complex issues like supply chain that are going to be really critical. And I think we will need to, I completely agree that, there remains more to do to understand the role of NESO with government and with Ofgem, and that will be added to by the addition of an entity like GB Energy.
I was just going to say, building on what Josh said, mine is quite simple. Don't replicate anything that's already out there, basically. There's no point replicating what's there. So if it's nothing new, focus on something new. What can be focus on those the heavy stuff that private capital perhaps can't bring in. Focus on that.
And say something relatively quickly.
Yes.
So I was quite encouraged by the fact that it was quite well recognised quite quickly that the UK Investment Bank does already fulfil that purpose. So actually, quite pragmatically, they've said, well, okay, let's use the UK Investment Bank. That makes sense. I do think maybe in that cross-cutting supply chain area that could be very useful for GB Energy. And with regard to Chris Stark's, mission control, I don't see any conflict whatsoever with NESO, just to say, because I think actually, I hope that what that means is it's about getting some of these decisions hammered through within the next couple of years when the agenda is very large, and we already know that the Secretary of State's going to be going out to the next COP and negotiating all the various things that the UK has to do with that. So I hope that's about commitment to get some things done. So that's what I'm looking for from that.
Excellent. Well, that's a lovely segue. I'm going to take a bit of license and maybe adjust your question a little bit, because a week on from the election, I'm not sure there's anything at this point we would change in FES' early days, but maybe to ask each of the panel members for a closing thought on, by the time of the next FES document, what is the one thing that's either in it or not in it at the minute that you hope has changed?
Oh, that's a hard question.
Sorry, I probably should have given
one thing.
Go on, Meeta.
I think I don't have a specific. I think one of the things that everyone finds useful around the FES is the stakeholder-led approach, and I think we as an organisation, as we stretch our wings further into the whole energy space, will be wanting to enhance the engagement that's happening with those players in the new areas that we've been talking about. And Lauren and team do a lot to bring together people, get learning from them, and to invite challenge to the work that's going on. And I think that's really important. One thing I will call out is that there's been a huge amount of work has happened around industrial clusters with the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge, and a huge amount of vital learning, key relationships, data have been generated through that. And it's finding roots in, as a new organisation, as NESO, that didn't exist during the development of this stuff, finding roots in to be able to leverage that information and bring it into the FES as it goes forward is going to be really important.
Jimmy, if you've got one thought.
It'll be interesting to see in a year's time what impact planning changes have made.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting.
Jane?
So in here you say that there's going to be a nice piece of work done on whole system optimisation. I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
Excellent. Josh?
I spotted, we were talking about it before, that as part of Chris Stark's new mission control, alongside that announcement, ESO, NESO are going to be commissioned to come up with a pathway to 2030, or at least kind of a set of advice around what 2030 looks like. For me, the thing that should hopefully be clearer by this time next year is what the government's 2030 mission really means in practice, what they're targeting by 2030 and not, and critically what that then means in terms of their immediate priorities, because the amount that needs to be built by 2030, even in the kind of scenarios, the pathways that don't currently get you to 2030, are eye-opening. I'd definitely recommend people look at the numbers that sit behind that. So critically for me, government setting out what their 2030 mission is and how they're going to deliver against it will be critical, because then that will guide the sorts of choices that FES can make next year.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, we're out of time, but as I say, there are lots of the team here, so please, those of you who didn't ask questions or have got follow-ups, please do talk to the team. So all that's left to me is to thank everyone that has joined us online this morning, and to all of you who've joined us here in person. A recording of this and slides will be available in the next week or so. I want to say a huge thanks to Lauren and her team, a few of who are here today. There's an awful lot of work and effort that has gone in over the last year to get us to today, to say thank you to them. And then finally, please do join me in saying thank you to the panel this morning who've covered a very broad and wide-ranging set of topics. So thank you.
Very good.
And for those in person, please do join us downstairs back in the library for lunch.
you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.